Good evening, everyone. I'm Joan Porter McKeever, the Vice Chair of the British Institute for the Study of Iraq. And on behalf of the BISI, I'm delighted to welcome you this evening to this webinar talk by Dr. Paul Collins, who is the BISI Chair and who would normally chair the evening's proceedings, but he's giving the talk. The BISI promotes research and education about the history and societies and cultures of Iraq, and many of the people here tonight would be our members, but we also have quite a large worldwide audience, and we welcome you all. To learn more about our work, please visit our website, because we do actually have quite a lot of details there of our projects and past projects and our visiting scholar schemes. But this lecture, Rethinking Mesopotamia in Oxford, will also be archived and can be listened to later again or shared with other people. The lecture will focus on the dual language temporary exhibit that Paul has organized called Owning the Past from Mesopotamia to Iraq at the Ashmolean Museum. And it will be open when it opens in May, we hope, till the 22nd of August. And it will be my first cultural outing when the time comes. Before I start my introduction to our speaker and giving you some background, a few housekeeping rules. These talks are all through our own personal spaces, and obviously sometimes some of the internet might go down. Sorry if that is the case. But please, would you put your questions during the talk into the Q&A? We do not have a chat section. It's going to be through the Q&A, and we'll monitor them all and either ask them individually or bulk them if they seem to be appropriate. I'm going to give you some details on Paul, although most of you probably know him quite well. He's the Jaleh Hearn Curator of Ancient Near East in the Department of Antiquities at the Ashmolean Museum, and is currently a U Prize Fellow at Jesus College, as well as a supernumerary fellowship holder at Wolfson College. He has worked previously as a curator at the Middle East Department of the British Museum and the Ancient Near East Art Department of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. He received his PhD from the Institute of Archaeology, the University College London. As well as being a BISI chair, he's also the co-investigator with Professor Eleanor Robson of the Nahrain Network, along with a strong team both in London and in Iraq. Paul's research interests will be evident in his talk, but they center on the archaeology and material culture of ancient Iraq and Iran, with a specialism in the Uruk and early dynastic periods and the Neo-Assyrian period. He has written and edited a number of scholarly books, augmented most recently by a children's book, Discover Ancient Sumer, published by the Ashmolean with the support of Dangor Education through the BISI. And with Charles Tripp, he was the co-editor of the publication of our conference book on Gertrude Bell, A Life and Legacy, published by the British Academy. And it is a book that I urge all of you to purchase because it covers many interesting things. But on that note, I think I will, without further ado, turn over to Paul and ask him to start his talk. And thank you very much, Paul.
Joan, thank you very much indeed. I will just share my screen, and then I hope everyone will be able to see that. Very good. Well, thank you very much, Joan, for that kind introduction. And I'm delighted to be able to talk to you today about some of the work we've been doing at the Ashmolean Museum, so my institution, but thinking very much around the history of Iraq and how we tell those stories. So rethinking Mesopotamia in Oxford is the theme. Now, for those of you who don't know the Ashmolean, and I'm sure many of you will, just let me say a few words about the institution itself, which is, as it were, the background, the theatre in which we will be exploring these questions about telling stories. The Ashmolean is perhaps most famous for being the oldest public museum in the United Kingdom. And although that's certainly the case, having been established in 1683, the building that you see in the image here, and indeed really the institution itself as we think about it today, is very much a 19th century creation. And that's an important date, an important period for thinking about how the collections were gathered and indeed the way in which they have been interpreted. The Ashmolean, of course, is immensely rich in terms of its collections and makes working for the museum extraordinary experience every day, walking through galleries where we have one of the finest collections of drawings by Raphael, for example, or indeed is one of the few places outside of Egypt that can really explore the foundations of that ancient civilization, rich in other paintings and classical works, including perhaps the finest collection of Greek vases north of the Alps. So an extraordinary place in its own right, but we're also very rich in being able to tell stories around the Middle East, stories that range really from the earliest farming communities, places like Jericho in Palestine, right the way through to the great empires of the Persians, the Achaemenid and Sasanian empires. So some 10,000 years of narrative can really be told through the collections. The objects from Iraq, however, are particularly interesting in that wider Middle Eastern context. And at the Ashmolean, we have some extraordinary objects. These proto-cuneiform tablets, some of the earliest writing in the world, from the site of Jemdet Nasser, for example, in the late 4th millennium BC, available really only in Oxford or Berlin or Baghdad would be the other places you would need to go. And along with this very early writing, we have some wonderful objects, beautiful objects that date to the same period, such as the cylinder seal you see on the right of the slide. Other famous objects from Iraq include a big collection of cuneiform tablets, the second largest in the United Kingdom after the British Museum, and some really famous objects such as the Sumerian king list. Here, the most complete surviving example of these king lists, which really illuminate how the ancients themselves thought about their past and how kingship was fundamental in the way in which they thought about their lives. And other objects, and perhaps the largest and heaviest object in the collection is this really fine Assyrian relief coming from the throne room in the Northwest Palace at Nimrud, one of a pair that guarded a gateway into the throne room itself. So remarkable objects from Iraq. Those collections were displayed in the Ashmolean on the upper floor of the museum between about 1960 and 2005 in the so-called Draper's Gallery. Many of you may have visited it, can remember it. It was displayed in a typical fashion of post-Second World War, dense displays of really much of the collection. And in the Draper's Gallery, the material was divided by region. And I hope you can see from these slightly grainy images of the old gallery how the space was divided, color-coded between regions with these large maps on the walls to situate you in relation to the modern countries. So Iraq above the area colored blue, and then to the left you can just about see Iran, and then in the other screen Syria and Palestine. And helpfully to navigate you through the Draper's Gallery, you could pick up a leaflet such as this one at the information desk as you enter the Ashmolean, which again emphasizes this division of the collection by regions. There's Iraq, color code blue, with some of the highlights indicated. The Weld Blundell prism, that's the Sumerian king list, a Nimrud ivory, and a few other items which were thought worthy of pointing out in this very dense display. Well, that was all swept away between 2005 and 2009, when the Ashmolean was pretty much completely refurbished. Only the original facade of the building and some galleries behind it were retained, but otherwise a completely new building was erected behind the facade, and a new gallery devoted to the ancient Near East was created on the ground floor. This was part of a suite of galleries which explored the ancient world. And the new museum was arranged in such a way that you could come in on the ground floor to the ancient world and then move up through the space, moving forward in time through the medieval to eventually reach the modern world and indeed the restaurant on the roof. And that's the current arrangement of the galleries. The ancient Near East gallery, however, was opened with the new museum in 2009. And I came to the Ashmolean a few years later in 2011. So I inherited this display. And from that date to now, it became really apparent that there were some issues with the new gallery. And one of the most striking issues we faced was the one you can see on the image on the left of the slide. You have effectively a long corridor which leads from the entrance where the photograph is taken, from the welcome space, so the main entrance of the museum, through to the sunlit gallery beyond, which looks at ancient Cyprus. And this was an incredible draw to visitors. They would simply march through the ancient Near East gallery, which seemed rather gloomy by comparison, drawn to the light at the far end. There was nothing in the way, as it were, to intrigue them or divert them. And one of the issues with the gallery was that there was really no interactives, nothing to engage people emotionally or physically. So as a result, the Near East gallery really didn't do the objects justice. And it was largely through the design space, as well as the rather poor lighting, in-case lighting. So the remarkable stories being told through the objects were largely lost. If we look at the plan of that gallery, and again, many of you will no doubt have visited it, the greatest challenge really beyond the physical layout and the rather gloomy feel of the space was that it endeavored to tell an enormous story, that 10,000-year narrative. And it really was the multiplicity of languages and peoples and regions that for the uninitiated visitor faced an incredibly difficult, complex mosaic to unravel. And so you moved from themes like religion and writing to specific sites like Jericho and Nimrud, broader coverage of some areas such as Anatolia and early farming, and then the Neo-Hittites appeared on a plinth at one end of the gallery. So although in many ways it was attempting to be comprehensive, it also was incredibly challenging, particularly for those who didn't know anything about the region. One of the biggest challenges, however, within that complex organization was that it no longer retained the previous galleries' attempt to situate any of these places in the modern world. So when I arrived at the museum in 2011, there was nowhere in the gallery that referred to Iraq. Mesopotamia was referenced numerous times, but nowhere could a visitor understand that Mesopotamia was modern-day Iraq. And so there was a separation between the ancient world and the modern. And I attempted through label changes to address some of that over the years, but it was a really major concern, and one that I was very keen to try and address. During those 10 years that I've been at the museum, there were other things that helped to shape my thinking about how we should be approaching telling these stories in the museum. One of them was the increasingly loud and vocal and organized questioning of how collections were formed in museums. A desire to what has been described as decolonizing the museum, thinking about the objects in terms of their colonial legacy, the connections with slavery, and with conflict, and how many of the stories told in museums simply didn't address any of these issues. There was also the question of who should tell these stories, who had responsibility, and who selected the stories to present around the objects. So this was very useful thinking as we moved towards the potential of reforming some of the displays. The other, of course, tragic events that were happening in the same period was the ongoing suffering of the people of Syria and Iraq. The legacy of occupation, invasion, sanctions, and ultimately, of course, in more recent times, the terrible tragedy of Daesh and the murder of innocent people, and of course, the targeted attack on their heritage, their identities. And here we can see those dreadful images of the destruction of Nimrud and Mosul Museum, just examples of these terrible events which have seen how the heritage of the region was being obliterated and as part of an attempt to erase the lives of individuals. So that too was helping to shape the thinking of what we were doing in places like the Ashmolean. And finally, for me, one of the great sort of turning points in the way in which I began to think about the importance of objects and what they could actually do for our understanding more broadly was the development of the Nahrain network at UCL, led by Professor Eleanor Robson. Very much her vision through many years of working with the British Institute for the Study of Iraq. And I worked with her from around 2016 to put together a proposal which received funding from the Global Challenges Research Fund, UK government fund, through the Arts and Humanities Research Council, to initiate a really exciting research project which supported research by local people, local experts in Iraq, researching their own histories, museums, heritage sites, libraries, archives, universities, supporting the humanities and social sciences in generating research within the country after the terrible legacy of decades of isolation and deprivation. And it was really this wonderful opportunity to be part of the Nahrain network that has helped to shape, well, what I'm going to be talking about today, the various projects that have emerged at the Ashmolean and ultimately the reshaping of the way in which we tell some of the stories. Now, one of the issues with permanent galleries is that they are rarely provided with the funds sufficient to make changes. So the big redevelopments at the Ashmolean that opened in 2009 was immediately, in many respects, fossilized. All the interest and activity in places like the Ashmolean are devoted to temporary exhibitions, particularly the big paying exhibitions, which are so essential in many ways for funding the institution, as well as, of course, trying out new exciting research finds and initiatives, as well as new ways of thinking about displaying objects. So in museums, we're reliant very much on slightly ad hoc moments when opportunities arise to refurbish and readdress the ways in which the permanent galleries are displayed. It is, I think, a real issue for museums, and one that needs to be part of rethinking about how they're actually funded and operated. But I was very lucky, after having been involved in thinking about the possibilities of a new gallery with all these other, all that was happening beyond the walls of the museum, to be given some funding by the Saracani family. And very generously, Ali and Sabine Saracani, and particularly the enthusiasm and energy and really the extraordinary academic knowledge of Ina Saracani has enabled the Ashmolean to refurbish the ancient Near East space. So immensely grateful to them, and we will be naming the gallery in their honor. So we began to think from around 2018, 2019, of how we begin to approach reshaping the gallery space. It wasn't going to be possible to do anything much more than that particular space. The organization of the ground floor galleries into the ancient world and the divisions between those galleries would have to be retained, even though those too could be questioned. Why should there be an ancient Near East gallery divided from other parts of the world, for example? So we were constrained to some extent by the existing layout and architecture. But nonetheless, we could begin to think about how we could tell the stories in the gallery itself. And we did so first by actually thinking about the tone and messages that we wanted to address in the gallery. So using a gap in the exhibition schedule, in a space in the lower ground floor of the gallery, we were able to set up a temporary display, which we called Doing Things Differently. This was a way in which we would invite visitors to the space, whether casual visitors to the museum who simply happen to be walking through, or more organized groups that we would invite in to respond to the questions we were asking, a way of getting feedback. So we asked about the name of the space, the ancient Near East. We asked about the way in which we presented text, asking questions, the way in which we presented objects, either as groups or as individually, and whether the labels needed what we call the tombstone information, the detailed information about accession number and material and date, or whether there are other ways of doing that. And this was incredibly informative. We laid it out in a comfortable fashion with comfortable chairs so people could relax. Chairs are very often absent in museums, and they become very tiring places. So this is something else we wanted to think about. Spaces to sit and contemplate, as well as, of course, enjoy the objects. One clear direction came out of doing things differently, and that was the name of the gallery. Ancient Near East meant very little to most of our visitors. Near to what? East of what? Clearly a very Eurocentric approach to thinking about the region. Ultimately, after much debate, we decided to use ancient Middle East. This was a term that's still very problematic, still very Eurocentric, but for most of the people who visited the gallery had a sense of meaning. They knew where they were sort of in the world. It's a term that was much more familiar to them from the media and other forms of engagement. So we thought, although clearly still problematic, there was no clear, easy answer to this. Ancient Middle East would be where we would go. And it does indeed seem to be the way in which both scholarship and more general engagement is moving globally. So again, tying into a general trend in the way in which we use this terminology, but still recognizing that it comes with really quite significant issues. So we're now thinking about developing the Ancient Middle East Gallery. Another project that helped us to shape the new gallery was a small project that took place in 2019, which we called Voices in the Gallery. And in this, we invited into the space students from a local Oxford secondary school. And the students were displaced students from Africa and the Middle East, who were in Oxford, an immensely diverse city. And we joined with their English teachers, English, of course, being very much their second language and a part of the journey they were on, having arrived in the UK. And they came to the Ashmolean, and we allowed them to actually physically engage with the objects, something again that museums rarely allow, simply for conservation reasons, if nothing else. So they could handle objects, and they chose objects in the Middle East Gallery, which they connected to, had meaning to them. So they saw something that visually connected to them, or it reminded them perhaps of their homeland. We recorded their thoughts, and then they went back to school and wrote out a label reflecting on their visit and what the object meant to them. The labels were designed within the museum, and you can see an example in the top right-hand side of the slide, where then their words accompanied their object. And the image in the bottom of the slide shows an object from the site of Nimrud, so dating to the 9th century BC, which is being handled by someone from Syria. And it was a wonderfully emotional and engaging experience, and reminded us very much how ancient objects can still be very relevant in the modern world for shaping identities and for maintaining relations with regions of the world that are home. And if you want to hear some of those recordings, which I have to say are really quite remarkable, yeah, I've got the website addresses at the bottom of the slide there, Ashmolean, and then go to Voices in the Gallery, and you can hear some of these encounters. But this was hugely helpful in thinking about what objects can do in the modern world. So that brings us to really the last of these projects, which really helped to underpin the development of the new Ancient Middle East Gallery. And owning the pass from Mesopotamia to Iraq is the largest of these projects we've been working on. And for this project, I really do need to acknowledge two people in particular. As we will see, it's involved a large number of people, but Dr. Mvanwe Lloyd is a museum consultant. She's an historian and lectures for the university. And it was really her idea to think about the moment when Iraq was established, thinking about the centenary that we're in of the establishment of Iraq and marking that somehow through a display in the museum. And her work and contribution to the exhibition has been fundamental. And the other person who has really, again, worked with the team to make this exhibition, I think, a really exciting and different experience is Nicola Bird, who's the Community Engagement Officer for the libraries and museums and gardens in the University of Oxford. And she really has extraordinary skills and experience in thinking about and enabling community engagement to happen. So I'm grateful very much to them both. And as I say, it wouldn't have happened without them. So what is the story we tell in Owning the Past? Well, it is a story that will probably be familiar to many of you. Indeed, if you were to read the book Gertrude Bell, A Life and Legacy, you would find much of that narrative in that. The narrative itself is really the backdrop, the theatrical backdrop, if you like, against which we ask questions. So let me just run you through the narrative so you're familiar with it, and then think about what we did with that in terms of our engagement and working with people. So the story starts here in a rather brief fashion by reminding people that the origins of Western encounter with Mesopotamia, the region that would become Iraq, starts in the 19th century with the removal of some of the most spectacular monuments from the region, such as the great Assyrian reliefs. So the encounter between the West and Mesopotamia begins at a time of imperial expansion by Britain and, of course, other European powers. But our real focus, the real start of the exhibition, really highlights the focus of the University of Oxford and indeed the Ashmolean in how Iraq was born. And we do that through some individuals, again, familiar names, I'm sure, to many of you, but rooted very much within the University of Oxford and the Ashmolean. Gertrude Bell attended Lady Margaret Hall at the end of the 19th century and was the first woman to be awarded a first-class degree in modern history in the university. She never graduated, of course. You weren't allowed to graduate as a woman at that time, but she was awarded a first-class degree. David Hogarth was appointed the keeper of the Ashmolean, in other words, the director at the beginning of the 20th century, in 1909. And it was he who really began to initiate collecting objects from what we think of as the Middle East for the Ashmolean. Very little in the collection from that region before. And then other individuals, T.E. Lawrence, a graduate of Jesus College in Oxford, and Leonard Woolley, a graduate of New College, both acted as assistants in the Ashmolean Museum. So heritage, archaeology, ancient history, and particularly the Middle East were really strong strands of interest in Oxford in the early 20th century. And this was because in Western scholarship, the Middle East was increasingly being understood as the origins of Western civilization. So the West took an interest in it, and in many ways were interested in claiming it to tell their own narrative of their own civilization as they understood it. So that's the point we make in the exhibition. And of course, then the opportunity to engage directly with this material came with the First World War and the invasion of Mesopotamia, part of the Ottoman Empire that had sided with Germany, and armies from India, part of the British Empire, so largely Indian soldiers invaded Basra and then through circumstances pushed north towards Baghdad. Meanwhile, Lawrence and Hogarth and Bell were recruited by British intelligence and sent to the Arab Bureau in Cairo, where they began, of course, to work on understanding the Middle East through their own experiences as archaeologists and historians. So they came with vital knowledge of the region. And Bell in particular is such a key figure in the story. She arrives in Basra in 1916 as Oriental Secretary and then moves to Baghdad the following year when the city is taken by the British. And it is in this period that the heritage of Iraq begins to be seen as something as souvenirs. So our poster boy for the exhibition is the image you see on the left of the slide, the Sumerian statue, which was dug up at the site of Istabulat to the north of Baghdad in 1917, when Sikh soldiers of the Indian army were digging trenches in advance of a battle with the Ottoman Turks. And out of a trench came this object. The soldier had almost certainly dug up a temple, and the pick that he was using to dig his trench gashed the front of the object. The object was acquired by the commanding officer of the 14th Sikh Regiment. You can see him in the middle of the photograph on the right of the slide. He is an Englishman, Colonel Earl, and it is he who gives it to the Ashmolean in 1919. So here, ancient Sumer, colonial invasion and occupation, and British control of heritage embodied in one object. Places like Babylon became tourist attractions for off-duty soldiers, such as you see here. So a site excavated by the enemy, by the Germans, were now claimed by the British. And of course, then in 1920, following the end of the war, the League of Nations divided the region into a series of mandates. Authority to govern the regions handed out between the French and the British. And Britain was granted the authority to govern until such a time as the region could govern themselves, Palestine and Mesopotamia. And again, as many of you will know, there was an uprising against British occupation of the region and their attempts to govern it. And we see that uprising brutally repressed in 1920 when some 10,000 Iraqis were killed by RAF bombers and armored cars and troops. So a brutal start, and of course the British, keen to find a solution to governing the region, come up with the notion at the Cairo conference in 1921, a secret conference with Bell, Lawrence, and of course Winston Churchill, deciding to create the Kingdom of Iraq. That's a story we tell through the gallery, but then we focus in on the fact, of course, that heritage continues to be a central theme in the way in which the people who are establishing the kingdom are thinking about the new state. Sorry, my slides keep moving forward. Gertrude Bell is appointed Honorary Director of Antiquities, and major excavations start at sites in southern Iraq, including one by the University of Oxford and the Field Museum Chicago. This is a major dig between 1923 and 1933, and it is this that refurbishes the Ashmolean with its largest collection of material from Iraq. Thousands of objects, sorry, again, slides seem to be on automatic change. Gertrude Bell, in the bottom of the slide there, dividing finds between Oxford, Chicago, and a new museum she's creating in Baghdad. So the material split between sites around the globe. And as I say, this is the origin really of the collection in Oxford. The other story we tell in our exhibition is that during this same period, the borders of Iraq are being decided. And of course, the region is a complex mix of different peoples, different ethnic groups, different languages, different religions, different traditions. And any attempt to draw lines to create borders will inevitably disrupt many groups, some of which are mobile, others settled, and split groups between borders. And so some people were included in the new state and some weren't. And the ongoing legacy of these borders, of course, still very profound. So we wanted to think about how that narrative impacted the lives then and today. And so through Nicola's work with the community, we engaged 2 community ambassadors, as we call them, people who are employed by the museum to actually help us to bring together people to start exploring these issues. And we employed 2 community ambassadors, Mustafa Barker, who you can see in the top image with his hands together, wearing his protective blue gloves, and Nuha Abdo, who unfortunately I couldn't find a good photograph of, so I'm afraid you can only see her back in the bottom right-hand image, but Nuha and Mustafa were absolutely essential, who reached out to their friends and colleagues and wider communities to see who might be interested in helping us to think about these questions around the narrative and its impact today. And so we had a series of workshops and discussions at the Ashmolean where they handled ancient objects and thought about them. We asked them what the narrative meant to them. And as you might expect, the responses were as complex and as emotional in many ways as the narrative itself. So we captured their words, words that are rarely thought about in such narratives, and very rarely in the native languages of the region. And so this was something we were very keen to address. A few of the quotes here begin to give you a sense, I hope, of some of the ways in which they were engaging with these objects. And it began very much to reshape our thinking, the people who would be traditionally responsible for developing the narratives, and indeed their thoughts and ideas really reformed the way in which the exhibition was displayed, including such things as the actual title of the exhibition. The nuances and difficulties that won't be apparent to us emerged out of these very often, as I say, quite emotional conversations. The other thing we wanted to do was to highlight the ways in which that the heritage of the region was being lost as we were developing the exhibition through these terrible acts of Daesh, and the relationship between heritage, identity, and home. And so we commissioned Pierre Secunda, an artist who has been exploring these issues in his work, to create an installation so that we could reflect on these issues. And here you see Pierre's at work in the Mosul Museum in northern Iraq and in Kurdistan, molding the damage done to buildings and to ancient objects that had been destroyed, damaged by Daesh. And some of the drawings he made, which again you'll be able to see, I hope, when you visit the exhibition, made from ink formed from the burnt charcoal that he recovered from the Mosul Museum. So art, as it were, created out of this terrible destructive act. So Piers then created an installation based on the large Assyrian relief from Nimrud in the Ashmolean Museum. He made a copy of that, cast it, and then effectively destroyed it, imposing onto the relief molds of that damage that he had taken in the Mosul Museum. So layers of destruction here to reflect not just, of course, on the terrible destruction in Iraq and Syria, but also more generally as a metaphor for the loss of heritage and the loss of identities through ideologies, through neglect, and just through modern development, where the past is swept away without consultation or recognition of the importance in people's lives. So the end result is an exhibition which is dual language, Arabic and English. This is the first dual language exhibition, completely dual language, in the Ashmoleans' 300+ year history. Obviously, there are other languages in the Middle East, but the challenge of translating every language and then providing that as labels is formidable in a small exhibition space. But of course, there are other ways which that can be accomplished through audio guides. And this again is something we are thinking very, very much about for the more permanent galleries, even if we couldn't deliver it in this particular show. You can see Nuha, one of our community ambassadors. They're holding our Sumerian statue, again, without gloves. This is, you know, the point of engaging directly with this heritage and asking the question, who owns the past? Who tells those stories? Who actually, in a way, curates the past? So the end result is a really, I hope, interesting, compelling, provocative space where we raise these questions, where the voices of our partners from across Oxford can be read and seen. And we begin to think about the ways in which ancient objects intersect with more recent history and, of course, the contemporary world. And here's just not any expectation for these to be read, but just a sense of the range of people involved in putting together what is a relatively small exhibition. And of course, all our friends and partners in Oxford now who have their homelands from them in the Middle East, but also from across the university. So we drew on the extraordinary knowledge of experts like Eugene Rogan and Margaret Macmillan and Rob Johnson in helping to shape the narrative. So it was a really extraordinary collaborative operation. And again, I hope the exhibition does their work justice. And of course, exhibitions need funding, and so grateful to the support of the people you can see listed in the bottom of the slide, and of course, particularly the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, who helped support the exhibition to fruition. So how does this impact the permanent exhibition? Here is the old layout of the ancient Near East gallery with its complex attempts to address the multiple people's voices, stories of the region, an almost impossible task really to accomplish in one space. And the new plans for the ancient Middle East gallery will look like this. So what we hope we will have achieved in the new gallery is a much cleaner, focused approach to storytelling. And that's the key, that we will take the strengths of the collections rather than trying to be comprehensive and tell stories through the objects. And one of the stories that we will tell as part of the displays, we're calling Claiming the Past. This is essentially a reduced version of Owning the Past, a display which explains how the collections came to the Ashmolean and its colonial and imperial backdrop. The other region that also as part of that area of the display will have a projected film which explains what the gallery is about, but also gives you a sense of some of that past activity. So we will, for example, have clips of films such as this one, which was taken of the Field Museum Oxford University expedition to Kish, in this case in 1927 to 8, and to remind people that here, is a living experience. Here we see Iraqis, as they had become, digging big holes in the ground to remove objects to furnish the Ashmolean Museum with objects. And there'll be opportunities to pull together narratives by, rather than separating out, for example, writing into its own case, it will be embedded within a range of material of the same date to explore themes such as the first cities, the emergence of kingship in Iraq. And there will be plenty of maps demonstrating where these ancient sites are in relation to the modern borders of the modern country. So again, never losing that relationship between the ancient and the contemporary, that these are stories that are about Iraq. The new layout will also include opportunities for that emotional and physical engagement that was missing from the other gallery, the earlier gallery. So those blue blocks in the center of the spaces in this plan are all for interactive. So visitors will be able to try out a cylinder seal. They'll be able to try cuneiform writing, and they'll be able to listen to, see cuneiform tablets, of course, in a case devoted to schools and scholars and the great literary achievements of Iraq. But they'll also be able to listen to them in their original languages. So the Epic of Gilgamesh, the great story from Iraq, will be audible as well as visible. So we hope through these techniques and the experiences we've had on this journey towards developing the gallery, we'll make it a much more inclusive place. And we want to do that through storytelling, that sort of universal human way of engaging with the world. And I've always taken very much by this image from Morocco, actually, of a traditional storyteller, and that powerful way of engaging people. Of course, we'll be expecting both girls and boys, men and women in the gallery, unlike in this image where you see a range of boys. But any of you who have tried to teach, as I have, in a school, in an all-boys class, to get them looking like this towards you as the teacher is a remarkable undertaking. And so storytelling, when it works, is really very powerful. So what I want to leave you with is what we hope will come out of this process, is a new space where we can engage with the stories of Iraq and the challenges and issues around why those stories can be told in Oxford. But ultimately, and I often leave these lectures with this slide because for me, museums can be places where communities can come together through the lived experiences that we all share. And I think they are far greater than any differences we see or imagine. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, that was incredible. We have a few questions already, and anybody else who wishes to ask questions, please put them in the Q&A. Before I start reading the few that are here, one of my questions already was answered because I wanted to know the size of the Sumerian statue. But when I saw the hands, I know exactly the answer to that one. I wanted to find out whether you have brought any of your students from the university into the discussions about sort of rethinking the past, or has it been sort of museum led, or has it also brought in, you know, young scholars?
Well, those conversations in Oxford, of course, are very much going on. I mean, one thinks, of course, of the big debates around the statue of Cecil Rhodes that you know, dominates the college on the high street, and so you know, students are leading the way in thinking about these issues. So absolutely fundamental, again, part of the environment in which we're operating in a place like the Ashmolean.
So I will start with the other questions. One is from an anonymous attendee, which I can understand, but also a very good question. He's saying, Pia Secunda, some would argue this kind of work is profiteering from destruction rather than reflecting on it in a critical way. How does the creation of this tangible heritage and its display in the museum actually help understand or relate to the traumatic experiences of war and heritage destruction, especially in a context like Oxford and the Ashmolean Museum? And the main end of it is, why not choose to showcase the work of an Iraqi artist or several?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and certainly it's one that has been asked during this whole process. In the new gallery, we will have a dedicated space which has nothing on display, and that case will be precisely so that we can have co-curated displays and work with artists from the Middle East. That will be our ultimate goal. And I think we recognize actually at this point that that would have been an ideal direction early on. But we had worked with Piers before. He had done terrific work in engaging with the questions around heritage and its destruction. Worked indeed, had a display in the Iraq ambassador's home, for example. So he, it is a route in for people, I think, particularly who are interested in art in a place like Oxford, who thinks of the Ashmolean as a place for sort of contemplation and paintings and sculpture. So to some extent, his work allows that transition to happen between our traditional visitors at the Ashmolean, who may not have thought about any of these issues, to allow them to then be carried into a space where art allows them to be thinking about those issues. So I agree very much that in the future we need to be thinking about the response in the same way we're talking to people from the Middle East. We need to be reflecting that through the physical practice as well. But the work of Pir Secunda is immensely powerful. And I hope if you get the chance to see the work, you'll agree that it actually does raise all these issues around what heritage is and what it means in a museum context. To take an object that's, as it were, a star piece of the Ashmolean and then destroy it. You know, what emotions are raised by that? So yeah, complex issues for sure.
I agree. I've seen some of his work, and I do agree that it is very powerful. So from Osama Shukr Mohammed Amin, we have a wonderful lecture. Please, roughly, how many artifacts from Iraq are currently on display and not on display? And does the museum conduct or is conducting any excavations in Iraq for the time being?
So the museum isn't conducting, or indeed the university isn't conducting any excavations in the Middle East. It's very telling that they stopped sponsoring excavations at the beginning of the 1990s, when the practice of division of finds stopped in all the countries of the Middle East. Now, of course, that had stopped in Iraq much earlier, the end of the 1960s, but places like Jordan were still dividing finds between the excavators and their home museums, as it were, up until the early 1990s. But after that, sponsorship of excavations by the university stopped. So again, you see the direct relationship between acquisition and the support of that sort of work. So that again is part of the story around museums and their displays. In terms of the number of objects, we can only show a small percentage of the actual collection. I can't give you the numbers for specifically Iraq, but the Middle East collection, if we think of it more generally, there's about 40,000 objects. And we can only show in a gallery space of the size to make them meaningful in an accessible way, about 900. So you can see that there's a big divide between what's visible and what is not visible. But having said that, one of the things I spend much of my time doing is getting objects out from the reserves to be brought to study rooms, where researchers, but also members of the public, can come and look at them. And it also has to be said that a large percentage of those are very archaeological. So 40,000, a good percentage of those are sherds. Again, not something you'd probably want to see vast amounts of anyway. But again, raises a question about access and availability for sure.
Well, actually, this next question probably comes from Iraq, and it's very appropriate. Can Iraqis access the museum virtually online from Iraq?
It's a big project we're undertaking at the moment to try and make our collections available online. As we said, the Ashmolean is slightly behind other institutions like the British Museum, which has gone a long way to digitizing its collections. But if you go to our website, you'll see that our collections online is growing and sort of growing on a daily basis. We've got about a quarter of the collection online now. And that over the coming years, we will attempt to make everything available. So that's an ongoing project, an enormous one, it has to be said, but yeah, definitely for the future.
Okay, this is a question from a friend of mine that I share wanting to know. Jonas Thompson asks, most interesting, thank you. Can you give us the potential opening date of the exhibition, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So Owning the Past will be open as soon as the museum reopens, obviously according to government guidelines. We're hoping we'll be able to open on May the 17th, when museums will be allowed to reopen again. And then the temporary exhibition, Owning the Past, will be on until August 22nd. So I hope there will be sufficient time for people to see that. The gallery, however, we will have finished installation by the end of June. So the gallery will open, and again, we're on schedule for this, so I'm very pleased, 26th of June. And then, of course, it's available 7 days a week for free.
That's right. I'm writing that down. So Louise Wheel, who's a member, said, sorry, she has to leave, but she wanted to say, can we make sure that people get the recording of your talk? But since Ali Kader will be doing that to everybody anyway, I think that we can say yes. So Stephanie Daly asks, from my experience of showing people around the old gallery, I have found that people are intrigued by changes in interpretation by scholars and by the process of decipherment. Will those aspects have some place in your display and interactive engagement?
So I'm pleased to say that there will be a space on one of the pods where, much like the big case, where we'll have an opportunity to do co-curation and contemporary art works, there will be a space to explore contemporary research. Particularly important, of course, within a university setting, but the remarkable work that's going on in the School of Archaeology and the Research Lab, as well as, of course, in Oriental Studies, thinking about things like the decipherment of Proto-Elamite. We want to have a place where those can be raised and explored. So yeah, so opportunities for changing moments so that people can see what's happening actually, not just in Oxford, perhaps more generally, with exciting developments. And the decipherment of cuneiform will again be perhaps a pod activity where you'll see how cuneiform works, even if we don't go into the details of the actual history of how the script was cracked.
So lots of thank yous coming, but one person says, I'm curious, how did the visitor responses from the doing things differently space inform the development of the gallery? And they say, sorry if you've addressed this, I'm Zoom fatigue, my brain is fuddled. Hope yours isn't.
No, I did only touch briefly on it. I think, the clearest outcome was the change in the gallery name, but there was also ways in which we thought about addressing objects. Again, it was that question around, do you just simply, as was traditional in the Ashmolean, give the object a title and then provide its accession number and material, and which was always quite a complex way of trying to engage people with things, because you would see something that might interest you, then you had to move away from the object to find the label, and then of course when you found the label, all it said was what you could see anyway. So the Sumerian statue simply said statue, Sumerian, stone, 2400 BC. So you wanted to learn more, but you actually didn't get much more than just simply by looking at the object. So what this really revealed was that people appreciated having the narrative, the story that the objects were connected with, close to the objects. So this is what we'll be exploring, and we hope it works. Again, it's quite an approach which we hope will pay dividends, but we'll have a range of objects, and the text will be situated next to those objects, and it explains the context in which those objects operated. So the Sumerian statue will be described in terms of an image, potentially of a king, inlaid with precious metals originally, which represented the trade connections, and sitting at the center of a city, which involved writing. Examples of writing involved warfare, examples of an image of a chariot, and so on. So you begin to build up a picture of the ancient world in which those objects were situated. So again, it's a different approach, and that very much came out of those conversations in doing things differently.
Well, I will add that I think the idea of community ambassadors is wonderful, and the work that you're doing, I should say, will also help inform some of the developments at the Boston Museum, since you're already helping us on some of the signage, along with John Curtis and Noor Al-Gailani. So that some of these concepts, I can already see being very important there. So Renas Malakir has asked, also, thank you very much. This is very interesting to see how much effort is going into making the museum experience as informative and interactive as possible. When I saw Owning the Past exhibition on Facebook, I wished I could visit and see our heritage with my own eyes. Here I see the title Owning the Past problematic, as the past and heritage for us Iraqis more or less remain abstract, since we rarely have access to this very rich and complex past. Ooh. That's quite powerful.
And I think very much that sums up the issues that we wanted to raise in Owning the Past. And of course, with an audience, particularly who may not have thought about those issues, and to demonstrate that they are powerful and meaningful for so many people.
So another thank you from somebody called Nina Sonia. I haven't met, but thank you for this outstanding lecture. And then our an old BISI member, Richard Morris, says your lecture basically is prompting him to get to visit the Ashmolean as soon as possible. Thank you very much. And then Lorraine Tinsley from Canada says, sorry, I can't read them as quickly. Thank you for this fascinating discussion. I was very interested in your consultative approach via community ambassadors. Did the question of repatriating objects ever come up, and how did you approach this issue?
It was interesting that, in a way, because I expected that to be an obvious, immediate question. But in fact, it didn't emerge in the workshops. And again, it was there were so many different responses that came out of those conversations, which really, I think, reflected the complexity in which these objects are sort of, in a way, operating. There were people who felt that it was important the objects were in the Ashmolean because it reflected the pride they had in their heritage, and they wanted to share that. But there were others who certainly, and there were lots of people who simply had no interest in them at all, because they didn't play a part in their identities and their sense of community and what home meant to them. But perhaps not in the workshops, but of course, the question of repatriation is one that is increasingly vocalized. We see it, of course, in the press all the time at the moment, not least around the so-called Benin bronzes from Nigeria, where there's huge discussions around those objects, the fact that they were looted under this sort of brutal British military operation, and how some museums, I think the Humboldt Forum, are saying that they might even return them. So these are conversations that are really resonant, and we have to be conscious of that and acknowledge them for sure.
So this is the compliment. Julia Ryan said, would there be plans to rotate this, she says the collection, but I think she means exhibit, to other museums, so other people can see it at different times in different places?
There are no plans. In many ways, it is an Oxford Ashmolean story, because we wanted to highlight how embedded the institution was within these narratives, that you couldn't escape the mindset, in a way, of early 20th century Oxford University, and how that shaped the world. So it may not sit particularly successfully in other venues. We also never started the project with that intention, that it would be, as it were, a traveling show. This was an exercise in exploring ways of working, and we hope the benefit will come out of that rather than from the actual display itself.
Yeah. So one of our previous BISI Nahrain scholars, Dr. Roshan Mohammed Amin, says, great talk, thank you. Nice that our scholars are paying attention to your talking. So, and James Fraser says, thank you for a brilliant lecture. I wonder if you could reflect briefly on the role of the Ashmolean Museum as a university museum. Would you have approached the exhibition differently were it not a university campus? Or is the setting immaterial to these themes explored? Actually, you slightly covered that. But.
No, I do think being a university museum means we have, in a way, a flexibility to think differently outside the traditional box. I mean, I would say that is the role of the university museum, in a way. It's because we are a department of the university. I teach undergraduates, I supervise doctoral students. That's part of our everyday experience. So the sorts of challenges that come to us through teaching and through engagement with students from all over the world definitely opens up possibilities, I think, that might not be available elsewhere. So yeah, for sure, it's an absolute, to my mind, a real plus, a real benefit.
And BISI council member Rosalind Wade Haddon asked many thanks and congratulations to the new gallery and exhibition. Much looking forward to seeing it. I think we all are. I think I'll time it after June so I can do both. Yaktan Kadruji says, would the museum engage volunteers to go around with visitors explaining the objects?
So our community ambassadors really emerged out of a project that's being run at the Pitt Rivers Museum and the Museum of the History of Science, which are other Oxford University museums, called Multaka. And this is a scheme that I think originated in Berlin, actually. And you can also find in the University Museum, Pennsylvania now, where people from different parts of the world, particularly the Middle East, who might be refugees or displaced or just have Middle Eastern heritage, tell their stories in the museum gallery. So they may speak about the ancient objects, or they may speak about their own experiences. And so we drew on Nicola Bird's experience in running that project in the Pitt Rivers and History of Science Museum, and indeed engaged directly with many of the participants in those schemes. So yes, looking to the future, we would hope that that would be possible in the Ashmolean galleries as well.
So you just answered the next question, but I have to give her credit because it wouldn't be fair. Amy Kirby writes, I know that the Pitt Rivers has a Multaka Oxford scheme similar to the Pergamum Museum. Would the Ashmolean ever engage in anything similar? And I think you just answered that.
I hope so.
I just thought I wanted to make sure Amy didn't feel we left her out. So it's the end of the questions. I have to say that this has made me even more excited than I expected to be to come and see this exhibit. I should let everybody know that they did extend it because originally it was supposed to close soon, right?
Yes, actually, it's going to close the middle of May.
Middle of May, exactly, before we could even get into the building. So thank you to the Ashmolean for extending it. I'm going to end on a few notes. One to say, today, I was just telling Paul and Ali that I went over our visiting scholar scheme for the BISI, and we have sponsored over 50 Iraqis to come to the UK over the last 15 years. So part of the engagement, not just through museums, but also through all the other different threads and all the wonderful people who've helped throughout this. And the Ashmolean has been a major player in that, made me realize just how important keeping up these kind of engagements with Iraq have been. So unfortunately, you do have, no, she just, another Anna Christina also wants to come and visit the museum. Everybody wants to come and visit the museum. We have, I will make one little announcement and then we'll all clap, I hope, because it's not easy to clap on webinars, but that on the 21st, I believe, I better double check the date of April, that Sami Zubaydah is going to be giving our next BISI webinar, and he'll be talking on a lecture related to Iraqi food and heritage. So we don't have the title yet, but just put those in your diaries, save the date, the 21st of June. Of April, sorry. And I just want to, on behalf of us all, thank Paul, who also is, by the way, an absolutely wonderful chair of council to work with for this excellent lecture that we were really looking forward to. So I'll clap on all your behalves and say that was just absolutely wonderful. Thank you, Paul, for your
Thank you very much indeed.
And your
Thank you,
efforts.
everybody.
Okay, bye.